Well, hello everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Geospatial Data, the Foundation of Truth in Building a Climate Resiliency Strategy. My name is Amy and I am the Operations Manager here at the National States Geographic Information Council. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like to get more information on how to get involved with us, please visit our website, www.nishik.org, and I'll pop that into the chat box. Just some reminders for our call today. All attendees have been muted on entrance, and there will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, so please place your questions in the chat box, and they will be read aloud. Also, additionally, this presentation will be recorded, so please be on the lookout for after this. And with that, I will now turn it over to the presenters. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks to all of you for joining. As you think about the title of our conversation today, think about it comes to us in many forms. We hear about a new event, report, or happening nearly every day. Climate-related disasters jumped 83% from 3,656 events during the 1980 to 1999 period to 6,681 in the past 20 years. It's almost a 50% increase. Major floods have more than doubled. The number of severe storms has risen 40%, and there have been major increases in droughts and wildfires and heat waves. None of this is new to all of you. This comes out of a UN report about the human cost of disasters from 2000 to 2019. As you can imagine, with those kind of statistics, politicians and government at all levels have taken note, with increased planning and capital being allocated towards climate resilience initiatives, hence our conversation today. I'm guessing each of you or a member of your family has been impacted by significant climate events. For me, I've noticed multiple impacts. Earlier this morning, we were talking about the wildfire smoke that's causing poor air quality for many. Here in Minnesota, we're in the worst drought ever recorded in the springtime for Minnesota. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dan Ross. I am the Strategic Advisor for the Public Sector at Ecopia. Today, we are talking about building climate resilience. More specifically, we are focusing on the important role that geospatial data and GIS play in building a climate resilience strategy. I'm joined today by Brandon Pollan, the Senior Director of Public Sector and International Development at Ecopia AI. Brandon leads the development of Ecopia AI's global solutions in developing markets and oversees the North American public sector clients. Brandon holds a Master of Science in International Business from the Richard Ivey School of Business in Toronto, and a CEMS Master in International Management from the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland, a world traveler. Brianna Brown is a geographer and a writer specializing in geospatial storytelling. As the Director of Content and Product Marketing here at Ecopia, she works closely with organizations to share compelling applications of geospatial data to inspire innovation. Prior to joining Ecopia, Brianna worked in various GIS-related roles at SafeGraph, Precisely, and Esri. She has also volunteered her GIS and data expertise with the United Nations and Catholic Relief Services. Brianna holds a master's degree in GIS from Penn State University and a bachelor's degree in geography from Villanova University. Just a reminder, as we get started today with these two great speakers, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the Q&A session toward the end. Brandon, let's start it out with you.
Thanks very much, Dan. Appreciate the introduction. NSGIC, as always, thank you guys so much for bringing everyone together here. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I was taking a step back before we kicked off here to think about the first time I presented to this group. And I believe it was back in 2019. And at the time, we were just kind of introducing Ecopia to you guys. We were talking about the work that we were doing, geospatial data creation. And it's pretty amazing to see where we've come and the relationships we've established with this group and other stakeholders. So the presentation today is going to be a bit unique. We're not going to focus too much on what Ecopia is doing. We're going to highlight the data sets that we're creating, and we're going to highlight a few unique initiatives, but the primary focus of this is education. Before we dive really into the topic of our presentation, I know there's probably some people here who may not be too familiar with Ecopia, so I did want to provide a brief introduction just to highlight some of the background of our company and how we got to where we are today. So Ecopia itself commercialized about 10 years ago, and we started off as a geospatial data services company that was focused on leveraging artificial intelligence to extract building footprints. This path of, well, learning, technology development, and iteration effectively put us on a mission of mapping the world. We started off with our first big win, mapping all of Australia in terms of the building footprints. Shortly thereafter, we started mapping the building footprints for all the United States. But more importantly, what happened at that time was a transition from the company, where effectively the technology had matured to a point where we could start to leverage our workflows and leverage the deep learning models that we have created to extract both man-made and natural features. And with that, we started transitioning towards high resolution and high accuracy land cover mapping. And that's taken us on the journey and kind of continued to propel ourselves as large scale data creators, most recently with some fairly significant projects, including mapping all of sub-Saharan Africa, which was, as you can see from the stats, they're quite significant. But the real crux of what we're going to be talking about today is focused on our US nationwide 3D land cover, but more importantly, the value of geospatial data and how that geospatial data that we've created is so critical to a climate resilient strategy. So who has been leveraging this? Like I said, for most of you who have heard from us, you're familiar with this, but effectively, Ecopia has been tooling our products in a way that we're effectively transitioning the model of data creation, where it's traditionally been data as a service, data created for one-time solutions, data created for one-time projects, to now being data as a product. And data as a product to service the requirements of multiple industries. So not just the public sector, not just the insurance sector, but essentially what we're able to achieve through this is significant efficiencies in data creation. And that enables us to optimize how we're able to deliver these results to our clients. And as we're going to talk about today, how that can be beneficial to the public sector. Track record of success around the world. I always like to include this slide because I think it is a bit humbling, and it kind of brings and wraps everything together in the sense of talking about our mission to map the world. So these are the actual building footprints that we extracted: Australia, sub-Saharan Africa on the right, and then obviously the United States on the lower 48 on the bottom left-hand side there. And I always like to highlight this slide because when we think about geospatial data here in North America, we are extremely privileged in that data equity is significantly greater than what it is in other parts of the world. When we look at the data that we created in sub-Saharan Africa, those are parts of the world where Google Maps didn't exist in a lot of those areas. Identification simply of building footprints or understanding where populations were, let alone road networks, was not something that was ever done. So when we think about how that data was used from a humanitarian standpoint and a planning perspective, it really highlights the value of geospatial data, and it highlights the work that we're doing here today and the work that you guys are doing, and how it really is the foundation for decision-making and planning. So as a summary, before we really fully move into the crux of this presentation and talking about, what everyone I think is here to hear about, I wanted to finalize just to effectively say that over the past year, essentially what we've developed is the first 3D nationwide land cover map derived from high resolution aerial imagery. Historically, land cover has been a raster product, or it's been a vector product produced at coarser resolutions. The higher resolution data sets have been leveraged on more municipal sides or smaller communities. But generally speaking, these high resolution data sets have been focused towards those communities that have the resources. And I think that's going to be a big piece of the discussion point today, is the concept of data equity and data equity across larger spectrums of communities, and how it relates to making sure that not just those communities with the resources have access to this information, but how can we provide information so that planning can happen across the spectrum, whether that be at the state level or federal side. So climate resiliency. I think everyone here, as Dan mentioned, has been impacted by climate change or natural weather events, whatever they may be, over the past 10, 20 years, and seen a change. And with that, we're seeing a lot more conversations take place. Specifically, we're even seeing recognition on the federal side and alignment towards them specifically targeting and releasing funds to help develop plans for this. Historically, we've seen climate resiliency and planning, focus towards FEMA initiatives, whether it's hazard mitigation planning, municipal planning efforts, but we've never seen it to the scale that we are right now in terms of both an emphasis, but also an allocation of resources. So why? Why is it becoming such a problem now? So I'm by no means going to be able to capture the full picture here, but what I am going to do is highlight what we believe geospatial data has a foundation in terms of really supporting. So the first one, flooding. I think this is fairly evident to most of the people in this group, but what we're seeing is drastic sea level rises. We're seeing the increased impact of storm surges during hurricanes and weather-related events. The impact of those events being even increasingly devastating, especially due to the change in land use and land cover in coastal communities. And the result of this has been extensive costs to communities, not just from a financial perspective, but also a significant risk to human life. So with that, what is the threat? So we wanted to take it a step further and say, okay, how large is this impact? And using our data set, one of the quick studies we just did was to understand what is the actual building footprint count, and can we develop, can we develop an understanding of the economic impact of rising sea level? So within a 1 mile buffer of the US coastline, and yes, I recognize that this coastline includes areas that are also the Great Lakes. However, I still believe the impact is significant. There is about 8 million structures, but I would say more importantly, or kind of misleading within this data, is within those communities are some of the largest US cities with the highest population densities: LA, Chicago, Miami, Houston, San Diego, if not even entire downtown cores, if you look at, for example, Manhattan. So although it's very difficult for us to fully evaluate the economic risk or the full risk associated to these flooding and sea level rise problems, it's pretty apparent that this could have a devastating impact on both the economy and the risk to natural life. Next one, wildfires. This one I think is a hot topic, especially as of everything that's been happening recently. The graph speaks for itself in the sense of identifying the full risk of what we're seeing, but more importantly, identification of the increased volume and number of fires. So not only are we seeing an economic impact from the side of the increased volume of these fires, but we're also seeing the impacts it's having on communities. So that photo on the right there is actually taken from New York City last week. And I think one of the elements that people forget to think about a lot with wildfires is they think about, the devastation to the rural landscape. They think about devastation to properties. But the one thing that often gets overlooked when you're not necessarily in the circumstance is the impact of smoke and the impact that has on the health of communities and people who have, who are more at risk or prone to issues that are related to poor weather conditions, such as asthma. So this is another huge impact that we're seeing affect the communities. Next one, extreme heat, urban heat islands. This is one I really like to highlight because effectively what we're seeing is urban heat has been the leading cause of death in terms of weather-related issues for the last 30 years, and it's only increasing. The more concerning fact of this is that those deaths are generally isolated or increased percentages in lower income communities and higher at-risk groups. And essentially, the identification and the preparation for these has often been overlooked. So what we're seeing is drastic increases in temperature due to urbanization, due to urban sprawl, where we're effectively taking away natural landscapes that are absorbing heat and replacing those with impervious surfaces that is just continuing to iterate and make the problem significantly worse. With that, there's obviously significant other impacts and devastations, but the problem itself is fairly evident. And it's one that we actually took and said, okay, how does land cover relate to this? So just a little bit of a tease for towards the end of this, we actually did a study over the greater Houston area that we're going to examine this. So stay tuned for that towards the end of this presentation, because we're not just going to be talking about the value of land cover and geospatial data, we're going to demonstrate it. So the solution. Obviously, we're all here from a geospatial background. Geospatial data is what we're here to talk about. So what is the solution and why is geospatial such a critical component to it? Well, first off, the solution, it's not the full solution. I think everyone here understands that in order to truly solve these problems, it's going to require multi-tiered strategies, significant investment on lots of fronts, further infrastructure development. But to us, geospatial data is the foundation, and geospatial data forms that crux of what we need to be able to at least start to recognize the solution and start to put in place that plan. And with that comes the concept of a climate resiliency strategy. So, Ecopia, AI company, I thought to myself, what can we do to articulate this? Because there's been a lot of chat about, or people talking about climate resiliency strategies. We see this, both from a political side and also in general conversations. So I asked I went ahead and used a tool to figure that out. And so I asked GPT to actually classify what a climate resiliency strategy was. And to be frank, I was quite impressed by the result. And I'm not usually one to read directly from a PowerPoint or a slide deck, but I think it warrants me to read this. So a climate resiliency strategy refers to a comprehensive and integrated set of actions, policies, and measures designed to help individuals, communities, and ecosystems adapt and withstand the impacts of climate change. It involves proactive planning, risk assessment, and management aimed at enhancing the capacity of natural and human systems to cope with the changing climate conditions. Frankly, I don't think I could have ever come up with something that articulated it so well. And on that topic, we are going to focus on 6 elements specifically. And the reason I'm going to focus on those 6 elements specifically is because you're going to see that ties to a lot of funding applications as we progress through here. So, how do we think about this? Well, in my mind, I think about innovation. And I think about geospatial data being the foundation of innovation. In this case, the climate resiliency strategy. Without a strong geospatial data set or a strong understanding of our current environments, how are we supposed to plan, build strategies, and actually implement to deal with these problems? Which brings us to the foundation of innovation. And this is where Ecopia is starting to play into the mix and how we're starting to integrate ourselves and how we see the value of our data sets. So obviously this in itself is an animation, but essentially this is that concept of the digital twin and the actual ability to leverage these data sets to help solve some of our biggest problems of today. But let's not talk hypothetical. Let's actually dive into the concepts of how does geospatial data fit into the mix. Geospatial data is essential to developing and implementing a climate resiliency strategy. It's providing us with information on the location, extent, and vulnerability of natural and human systems. It's helping us identify areas and populations that are most at risk. Effectively, by leveraging geospatial data, we are able to tell the story of what and where. And to me, that picture of being able to present that is extremely important, because what we've spent so much time as an industry talking about is these issues. But the fact of the matter is, if we can't demonstrate it, the value of what we're saying is going to be lost. And this is where it becomes so important to be able to leverage these geospatial data sets and articulate them in a way that everyone can understand. So how does Ecopia geospatial data sets fit into the mix? Obviously, this is an Ecopia presentation, so I had to put a little bit about us in here. And with that, I'm going to talk about the foundational layers. So these are layers that we are developing, working with groups across the United States. Really exciting initiatives, especially in terms of what NOAA is doing in the CCAP program, but there's also a lot more that can be done. So when we talk about these layers in terms of how they fit into the mix, we start off with the foundational elements, the simple understanding of the man-made and natural world. And this is where those 2D foundational land cover and land use data sets are important. But it's not just looking at those coarse data sets that have traditionally been used on a land use land covers perspective. This is understanding communities themselves and understanding to the point of an individual property, an individual community. And as we're going to show in our case study a little bit later, it's critically important for us to have that level of detail. 3D elements. So we talked about wildfires, we talked about flooding, we talked about storm surges. Why is it important to have that elevation product? Well, it's pretty critical to understand, which populations are most at impact, elevation data. It's very important to understand where people are located in multi-level structures for emergency management. It's extremely important to understand how much forest canopy or how much vegetation is within a community in terms of fire prevention and planning. All of these elements put together are cruxes to a significant climate resiliency plan. And lastly, arguably what I would classify as the most important element of geospatial data is the concept of identifying and quantifying change. And this is arguably, in my opinion, the most overlooked aspect of geospatial data creation. Oftentimes, I feel like we get so lost in the idea of just being able to get access to data. We're so, it's effectively propelled by the fact that a lot of the times data access in the public sector is fueled by one-time funding. But we need to change that narrative. And we need to look at it from a different perspective to understand that the ability to have one data set is, yes, critical, but the ability to understand where that change is happening and having a similar data set likewise year over year, or even every 3 years, is critical in terms of understanding where to allocate resources. So I purposely use this example here because although it is only a minor change, what we're identifying here is both new and destroyed development. And when we think about resource allocation, when we think about understanding, you look at California wildfires, for example, understanding which buildings are where, if, you don't have a map of structures and you don't understand, perhaps there was a new build in 2 years and you don't know people are there, you're not going to allocate resources to that. So this is why it's important to make sure that you have current refreshed information and also understand how that data is created. So that's it on the Ecopia piece. Now I really want to dive into the strategy. And geospatial data strategy is effectively where we're coming into the play of understanding where do we fit into the mix as it relates to all of these programs and initiatives that we're seeing. Last week, Kim Jackson shared in the initiative group the NOAA announcement of the Climate Challenge program that is going to be going out in terms of grants. I believe it's $525 million or something to that extent of resources that will be made available. And so we look at that and say, okay, this is great. We know our data is important, but how do we articulate that? And that's where we're trying to come into the mix. So as you've noticed, I've highlighted key terms throughout all of these. And the number one thing it comes to when it comes to grant applications or trying to get support for these initiatives is making sure your key terms align with what's written in these policy papers. So hopefully this message is iterative and it sticks with it with all of you. And I'm happy to answer more questions as we go through here. But at the end of the day, the purpose of this is to be educational. So we're going to focus on 6 topics here. Geospatial data, and let's start with geospatial strategy relating to risk assessment and vulnerability mapping. So land cover data can help identify areas that are susceptible to natural hazards, flooding, urban heat islands, and wildfires. Essentially, by using this information, the public sector can develop effective risk mitigation strategies, and it can also prioritize those vulnerable communities and populations. So once again, risk assessment, vulnerability mapping, it's hitting on 3 points there that we're going to focus on: flooding, wildfire, urban heat. So flooding, how do we articulate the value of this? Essentially, we're identifying areas that are prone to excessive runoff and potential flood risk. High precision mapping allows for identification of specific areas of retrofitting green infrastructure. So for example, we can look at permeable pavement, green roofs, rain gardens. These are all elements that can be implemented on the municipal or on the local scale. Hydrological characteristics, excuse me. This is something that I've been in discussions with the state of Washington on quite a bit in terms of leveraging our open water databases in addition to the impervious surfaces. It's a critical component to have access to that information to do a proper analysis. And also how that can be integrated into hydrological models in terms of understanding those runoff water coefficients. Monitoring changes in impervious surfaces. This one, I think, speaks for itself in the sense of communities are continuing to grow. Whether it's destroyed impervious surface in the sense of shifting towards green infrastructure, which is great, but more often than not, we're seeing communities become increasingly impervious, excuse me. And with that creates significant challenges, not just on water runoff in terms of the impact of communities, but also the impact it has on wetlands. Wildfires. Land cover data can be used to assess types, distribution of vegetation. Critical for wildfire management. I believe, a few of the conversations I've had with on the federal side is, especially with groups like Landfire, who are looking at actually understanding these different types of versus tree versus shrub canopy and how that impact of fuel and how fires will spread based on the canopy maps. It also helps people understand the direction of spread. By understanding the types and arrangement of vegetation, you can better understand and plan for where that fire is going to go. So that enables firefighters and strategic crews to allocate resources in the proper places. Now, we also say that one piece of data is often good, but multiple combined together is great. So land cover data can be integrated with weather data and fire behavior models to simulate patterns. We talk about the value of AI. Well, we're doing AI for data creation. You can also leverage AI in terms of modeling and understanding to prepare for these scenarios, building contingency plans, evaluating evacuation routes, determining necessary resources and personnel. All of these elements are rooted in geospatial data. Urban heat. Like I said, this is one that is, I personally believe to be the most immediate need. Like I said, this urban heat and in general is the #1 weather-related cause for deaths in the United States. Greater than hurricanes, greater than tornadoes, greater than storm surges, greater than high winds. But it's often, I think, the most overlooked because people simply don't understand it. They don't understand the correlation between vegetation and impervious. They don't understand or don't believe that lower income, higher at risk communities are the ones who have the highest levels of impervious surface with the least amount of vegetation, and therefore the hottest communities. Being able to articulate that message and demonstrating that in a way that the public can understand is critical in terms of developing and deploying infrastructure. To the extent that we wanted to articulate this, and that is why we actually put together our own case study. I feel like a lot of times, on the business side here, we talk a lot about what our data can be used for. We say, it's great to do this, it's great to do that. So instead of talking about it, we're actually going to show you and demonstrate why it's important to have. And Brianna's going to jump into that just in a little bit after I finish reviewing these. Land use planning and management. This one I'm going to speed through a little bit more because I think this one is the most, this is very straightforward. You're identifying land areas for different types of land use. You're looking at physical, environmental, and socioeconomic factors and layering that with geospatial data. So, for example, you could identify geospatial data can help identify areas suitable for agriculture, urban development, or conservation. We're also seeing it being used agriculture, not necessarily just from the rural side, but also urban agricultural development, which is becoming increasingly important to on the federal side in terms of understanding the impacts of that and what's growing. Zoning regulations, environmental considerations, those are all elements from a planning perspective that at the end of the day are rooted in understanding communities. Infrastructure planning and design. In my opinion, this is focused on understanding infrastructure networks, land use, population distribution, how you're dealing with vulnerable communities, how you're planning to improve those communities, and understanding what's needed. It's about understanding the risks to certain communities, understanding which areas are closest to those shorelines, which areas in terms of elevation are going to be most prone to a natural disaster. Ultimately, this is all based on scenario modeling and simulation. Once again, if you don't have a strong geospatial data set, how are you expected to deliver the answers that can support proper planning? In my mind, it's simply not only not feasible, but I feel like sometimes decisions are made that are often jumping to the guns, for a lack of a better way to say it, in the sense that you're not using resources in the way that could help you do something that effectively could help mitigate these significant issues. Emergency response and preparedness. We just completed a study in the Austin district of Texas, alongside Texas University, and TxDOT, and we looked at impervious surfaces, we looked at road data, bridge data, and understanding the value of having that data set. So this all stems from in Hurricane Harvey, them in terms of understanding evacuation routes. And what we found is that they had about 18,000 linear miles of roads mapped. And then our data presented 33,000 miles of linear roads mapped. But the more concerning fact was the fact that their bridge data didn't have 3D attribution. So oftentimes the routing that would be selected for deploying resources was going over bridges that were actually flooded. And so that's a very direct example, but ultimately the concept of emergency response and preparedness, I think, is critical. This is talking about human life and deploying resources in the most time-sensitive scenarios. And I'm looking at my clock here, so I only got a couple more slides before we finish and go to the case study. But natural resource management, you know, there's a lot to take in here. And understanding conservation value or sensitive ecosystems, whether we're talking about wetlands and the impact of water runoff, whether we're looking at the population of endangered species, whether we're looking at you know, the impact on, I believe, well, I shouldn't say I believe, one of the big studies is on salmon populations and the migratory patterns that we're seeing on those sides. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, the value of land cover data is significant in monitoring change in ecosystems, forest management and carbon sequestration analysis, marine and coastal resource management, habitat suitability modeling. All of these are topics of significant interest and significantly, I should say, positioned in funding elements that we're seeing today. So lastly, community engagement and awareness. I often feel that within our little geospatial bubble, we can get lost in the technicalities of what we're doing. You know, we talk about a lot about LiDAR data creation, about 3D data models, about, you know, being able to model out our environments. But that messaging is limited in value to the general public. People don't understand what a point cloud data set is. They don't understand why we need those elements. They don't understand the value of having an impervious surface data layer. You know, they don't understand why it's so critical to understand the water runoffs from their even their own individual property. And as a geospatial community, I think it's our responsibility to do a better job of educating. And I think educating needs to be one of the largest priorities that we have as an industry, both from the private and public sector side, of why geospatial data and why the work that we're doing is so critical. And that level of messaging needs to be delivered in a way that's simplified. We are too technical with our terms. We do not speak to what resonates with communities. And I think that's one of the elements that I tried to convey here today was there is a lot of opportunity for geospatial data to do good and to address problems that impact our communities. And we as an industry just need to do a better job of communicating that. So how do we go about doing that? So this is where I'm going to pass it over to Brianna, who's going to walk us through an example of Ecopia actually going and doing our own study and doing our own research to be able to provide a pretty compelling argument of why geospatial data is important. So Brianna, I'm going to stop sharing here and I will pass it over to you. I do just want to say also, I see in the chat, there is quite a few questions coming through. We will have time to answer those at the end. But yeah, Brianna, please go ahead.
Sounds good. Yeah. There we go. Let me get set up here. So hi, everyone. I'm on the marketing team here at Ecopia. That basically means I make maps and I write about them. I think Brandon did a great job of summarizing just some of the different challenges that communities face, specifically related to climate risks and just climate resilience strategies. So we've been conducting some research here at Ecopia about how this risk relates to the population, and I'm going to share some of the initial findings with you right now. So like Brandon said, the world is changing incredibly fast. Not only is the environment changing, but so is the population. Population's growing, the distribution of that population on Earth is changing. Generally, there's this trend towards urbanization, but regardless, the world is changing, and so is the way that we as humans interact with it, resulting in land use change that greatly impacts climate risk. So there's some pretty staggering stats here. But what adds a layer of complexity is actually the known issue of climate equity. So I think we all know that unfortunately underserved communities around the world are usually bearing the brunt of climate change, even though they're contributing to it the least. So examples of this, they could include just less access to green space, increased susceptibility to extreme weather events, all the negative health implications that go along with that. And it's an issue around the world, but also right here within the US. So it's one thing to know that these things are happening, but quite another to actually take action on it. To take action, you need to layer in different types of data, layer it all together so that you can pinpoint exactly where you need to take action and which areas or populations are the most vulnerable to climate risk. So to see what types of insights this layered analysis can yield, we are leveraging our own land cover data with 2021 ACS data and looking at climate resilience equity in the greater Houston area. So here is our AOI. It's an extremely large and diverse area. It's over 12,500 square miles, comprised of both dense population and urban areas, as well as more suburban or rural agricultural areas. It's the fourth largest metro area in the US. So there's a huge range of incomes, different, socioeconomic groups. And that makes it like a great candidate to really look at for overall climate resiliency and how these factors all relate to each other. So I will minimize that. So first, what we did was we actually aggregated, not sure why this layer is not coming up. I can try a quick refresh. But what we did was we actually visualized the 17 layers of our land cover. Here we go. We aggregated it down to the census block group level and then calculated the percentage of impervious surface land cover per census block group, as well as the percentage of tree canopy per census block group. So here, little nifty slider thing, and you can click into different census block groups. You can see like this particular one, 73% of land cover is impervious, 14% is tree canopy. Kind of slide back over here. We can see there's some really leafy areas up here. Same thing, you can click in and see interesting demographic stats as well. But to see what that actually means, we layer that on with the number of households below the poverty level in each census block group and what their percentage of impervious surface land cover is. So because our AOI is so large, the results are really across the board, but not really when you consider like the census block groups that are really affected by this, even though at scale, this might not seem like, this huge issue. It really feels like an issue to people that live in census block groups with not a lot of tree canopy or, too much impervious surface. So let's see so because these households are below the poverty line, they also have less resources to actually overcome some of the negative challenges that are associated with climate change. We also actually calculated the income percentiles of the across the area of interest and their respective percentages of impervious land cover. And we found that the top 20th percentile of income in the Houston area, they have an average of about 36% impervious land cover, whereas the bottom 20th percent of income, they have 48% impervious land cover. So already there's a huge disparity there just between income and their ability to really respond to these types of climate risks, but also just what they're dealing with in terms of what's near them. So if we zoom into one of these particularly problematic areas, again, I'm sure the people that live here, they're really feeling this impervious surface disparity. We can see exactly like how real this might feel. So this bubble in particular represents the census block group. Yeah, you can see it here. So 82% of land cover in the census block group is impervious, and only 6% is tree canopy. So not only is there a large, percentage of people living in poverty here, but also they are less resilient to flooding and extreme heat events. So to see how we were able to calculate these census block group aggregations, let me just keep scrolling here. Here's more of like the quilted version. Might take a second to load, but again, this is just to see census block groups by how much impervious land cover they have. And then here, Ecopia data is loading. It's a lot of data, so my internet probably doesn't like me being on video and also loading it up. But you can see here, basically, this is where we extracted our data from the Houston area. We can see all different types of land use, how they relate to each other, which is difficult to do from imagery alone. So, you can isolate specific features, really identify exact places in the census block group where the population could benefit from tree canopy or green space. Afterwards, I can send out the link to this so that hopefully your internet will be a little bit more cooperative than mine, but you can see here, there's just some little patches of our land cover overlaid on imagery. But then we do the same thing for understanding tree equity. So, we saw earlier that that higher income households were more likely to have less impervious land cover, but we wanted to see the same thing for tree canopy. So our results showed that households in the top 20% of income have about 30% of tree canopy land cover, while households in the bottom 20% have only 21%. So tree equity is an increasingly important issue here in the US. As trees are increasing climate resilience to perils like extreme precipitation and heat events, they also foster more livable communities. And in April, the federal government announced $1 billion in grants to increase tree equity. So, if we zoom into this area, we can see that there are some particularly vulnerable areas and populations with lower income and less tree canopy coverage. So people living in these, lighter green areas, they are less resilient to flooding, heat, other climate perils, and they also have less resources to counteract that. Again, here's what the actual land cover would look like in a vector format, which is helpful for determining where to start allocating some of these new federal funds for tree equity. So I did isolate, it's probably a little hard to see here, but I isolated just the tree canopy layer as well. But this is just the beginning of this study. So we've only been doing this over the past couple of days, but looking ahead, we're going to layer in historical and projected weather data to see how extreme climate events have affected these populations and areas in the past, and also how they can expect to fare in the future, which can reveal important information about how to increase resilience. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, with that, I'm going to hand it back to Brandon.
Thanks, Brianna. So one, I hope you guys find that as compelling as I did. Like Brianna said, this is just the start. We leveraged that example just in terms of this webinar, and we wanted to be able to present to you guys an actual tangible demonstration of why high resolution and high accuracy land cover data is important. However, this is just the start. We would like to work with all of you to the extent of building similar studies, not just on a municipal or a regional scope, but on a state scope. How can we understand, we already have the data for a lot of these states, all these states effectively. So let's work together to be able to deliver concrete messaging and concrete information to support proper planning in the future. And with that, I wanted to say thank you guys all so much for your time. You know, today has been about giving you guys a little bit more information about Ecopia, but more importantly, talking about why geospatial data is so important and why that geospatial data is truly the foundation of truth. So I hope you all will take away something from this, be able to leverage it. We would really like to work with all of you and even support you through these grant applications to be able to get access to information like this and getting access to information, not just today, but in a way that it's recurring and consistently updated, which is at the core of Ecopia's values. So with that, that pretty much closes off the presentation, and that leaves us a little bit of time here for some questions. So Dan, I'm not sure if you want to jump in here and kind of navigate the questions, and I can do my best to answer all of them. I know this could maybe there may be more than we can handle, but we will certainly try to answer all of them.
We will, and if we can't answer one, we will respond to the individual person that asked the question after the fact to make sure that you do get an answer. So let's start it out. You mentioned 15 to 30 centimeter resolution of the source imagery, but what is the minimum mapping unit of features represented in the resulting data layers? And that's a two-part question. And the second part of that is the 3D information derived from photogrammetry, photogrammetric measurements, or are you also incorporating LiDAR data from the 3D program?
Great question. So effectively what we're leveraging is the raw stereo imagery to extract these features. So in principle, we are using photogrammetry approaches to build out elevation models in terms of the digital surface model, and including the DTM. So our approach to the 3D has historically been based off of the aerial imagery. When we talk about minimum mapping units, it depends on the feature classification and the feature type. So for example, building footprints, our minimum mapping unit is generally 100 square feet. When you look at tree canopy, it's going to depend on the product. So for example, what's being delivered to through the CCAP program, and I think Nate Harold's here. So Nate, if I butcher this, please write in the chat. I believe the minimum mapping unit for that one is classified at 5,000 square feet. But Ecopia's general workflow for a minimum mapping unit on vegetation is 1,000 square feet. Now, the other features, the other layers, they vary in terms of what that minimum mapping unit is, but it's considered to be quite granular. In terms of integration of the 3D LiDAR, to date, we have not leveraged, or I shouldn't say we have not incorporated into the elevation products. That's not to say that we cannot. Essentially, our goal right now was to start off by delivering that base layer of information. And in order for us to deliver that base product, we had to look at what was the most standardized commercial product available to us. And commercial imagery, from a cost perspective, obviously the updates of those products and the access to them simply is the most sustainable for creating a product like this. That's not to say we cannot integrate LiDAR data. We can certainly leverage those components, but our core layers are primarily derived from those stereo imagery products.
So Brandon, you got a couple of questions in here that are related. What is the temporal resolution? And you started to answer that question of these data products, and how does that vary across the country? And then related to that same thing, another audience member asked, will Ecopia's refresh rate be dependent on the frequency of NAEP collections?
Yeah, so the sake of this, I don't necessarily want to dive into too much of the accuracy specifications, because ultimately that is a bit longer discussion. But effectively, to summarize our accuracy metrics, Our impervious surfaces are guaranteed at over 95% geometric accuracy with less than 5% false positive, false negative. There's additional metrics there in terms of making sure, looking at overlapping polygons and consistent geometry. One thing I will highlight for this is when we capture the tree canopy, we're capturing the tree canopy as a unique polygon. What that means is essentially it's not included in the standard land cover because our standard land cover is a true impervious. So what you have is the impervious layer being the true product and then an overlapping canopy product. So we've effectively been, especially as it relates to climate resiliency, being able to provide those two products is critical depending on which level of analysis you're doing. And Steve, if there's any additional questions or if you want to dive into accuracy a little bit more, I'd be more than happy to walk you through the actual quality control and specifications of those products. But the statement we make is, although we're obviously not allowed to say we're photogrammetrists, we do leverage photogrammetry approaches. We're just optimizing them with AI, and our ultimately our results are considered to be that of, if not greater than, a GIS professional. And that's been evaluated on third-party basis, both in the private and public sector.
Oh, could you briefly talk, Brandon, about the frequency of updates?
Yes.
And the sources that Ecopia uses? Great
question. So as a rule of thumb, our update schedule for the entire country is a minimum of every 3 years. So that means, and as you can imagine, that is certainly somewhat aligned to the NAEP schedule. That being said, we are using multiple commercial imagery providers to be able to update our data sets. So our goal is actually to do it more frequently. Ideally, we would love to be able to update that data set on an annual basis. There are certain states where we are doing that, simply because there is more frequent refresh cycles available to us. The primary limitation is Ecopia is not an imagery provider. We're working with the leading commercial imagery providers and making sure we get access to the most current information, but there is somewhat of a limitation there. In terms of our update schedule for what we would classify as the top 400 counties, or the most, areas that represent greater than, I believe it's 80% of the US population, those will be updated on an annual cycle for sure.
So we're coming up on closing time here, Brendan. There is one more question that I think you could answer relatively quickly. How are you validating the accuracy of the resulting data products? So I know Ecopia uses humans in the process. Maybe you just want to briefly touch on that.
Yes. So our workflow, although it is an AI-based data extraction, we fully recognize that in order to guarantee accuracy specifications, there has to be a human component. So there's two sides to this. Our AI, essentially, when we do our modeling and the actual data extraction, you can think of it as creating almost raster probability maps. And we create raster probability maps that will associate to where it's likely to be whether it's a misclassification or a geometry concern. And those features are flagged for us to review and make sure that we quality control. In addition to that, we do random sampling over 5% of our areas to ensure that we can quantify and qualify the accuracy of our products. At the end of the day, I do like to always say that no solution is ever 100%, especially as it relates to land cover, which is why, our specifications are 95% geometric accuracy. But what we can guarantee is the product, especially based on our workflows, is consistent, especially over large scales. And that level of consistency enables us to maintain those accuracy specifications, not just when we initially create it, but also when we update it.
Thanks, Brandon. Folks, that wraps up our presentation today. You see Brandon's information there. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Brandon or anyone from the Ecopia team here on the call, and we'll get in touch with you to make sure that we answer all your questions. So many thanks to the NSGIC folks and the staff that are supporting us today. And mostly thank you Brianna, and Brandon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And lastly, we got to shout out Dan here to who's kind of been the leader of actually putting together the background information for this. Having that level of input from a stance of a strategic input, I should say, of understanding what these primary problems, groups like yourself are facing has been critical. So thank you, Dan, as well. And likewise, if there are any additional questions, we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks all.